half of $18 billion in federal funds. I mean, money meant for Minnesota's most vulnerable may have been stolen. So we have to ask, how did what authorities are calling potentially the greatest theft of taxpayer dollars in U.S. history happen right under the state's nose?
And that's precisely the mission for this deep dive. We are unpacking the Minnesota Megascam. It's a series of, well, sprawling and interconnected fraud schemes.
With the most prominent one centering on a nonprofit called Feeding Our Future.
Exactly. And we have a stack of sources here detailing what federal prosecutors have just repeatedly called staggering industrial-scale fraud.
When you look at the sheer numbers, the scale is, it's almost hard to wrap your head around. Since 2018, Minnesota has administered 14 of these federal programs. We're talking about roughly $18 billion.
Right. And authorities are now estimating that the total loss, across all of those programs could be half or even more of that.
So we could be looking at a figure approaching $9 billion in total alleged theft.
But we do need to be clear for you, the listener, about the distinction here. That $9 billion figure, that's the potential loss being investigated across the board. Our focus today, where we have the charges and the convictions, is primarily on that central organization, Feeding Our Future.
And that specific case involved the theft of over $250 million, money that was intended for child nutrition.
The effects are just devastating. I mean, this goes so far beyond the financial loss. This level of fraud, it directly impacts the state's ability to run vital programs.
So services for kids with autism, families needing housing stability, all of that is put at risk.
It erodes the entire safety net. And of course, the fallout is also intensely political. These allegations, they immediately sparked a huge controversy.
You had President Trump capitalizing on the cases, targeting the state's Democratic administration, Governor Walz, and also the Somali diaspora community in Minnesota.
Exactly. So our mission is clear. We're going to dive into the source material to reveal the specific architecture of these scams, how $200 million was taken in just the FOF case, the frankly unbelievable luxury purchases it funded, and the profound systemic failures of state oversight that critics say paved the way for it all. Okay, so to really understand how this fraud just exploded, you have to start with the pandemic, right? The USDA waived a bunch of standard program requirements. The idea was to make sure kids kept getting fed during lockdowns, which, in theory, makes sense.
Unnecessary flexibility.
But in reality, it stripped away the most critical safeguards.
Okay, so let's unpack those waivers. What specific rules were dropped that opened the door for this?
The main one was the requirement for congregate dining. Previously, children had to actually eat together in a group setting,
Which provided a natural way to verify things. You could see the kids.
You could see the kids. It was a simple built-in check. By waiving that, meals could suddenly be distributed through almost any site. And, this is crucial, they also allowed for-profit businesses like restaurants to participate.
And that was a game changer.
It was meant to be temporary humanitarian flexibility, but it was weaponized almost instantly.
And the growth figures, they just show how quickly it was exploited. I'm looking at Feeding Our Future, the main nonprofit sponsor. In 2019, before all this, they got about $3.5 million in federal reimbursements.
Okay, and by 2021, at the peak of the scam,
Nearly $200 million.
that's a 2,800% increase in just 2 years. I mean, any legitimate operation, any system with basic controls should have immediately flagged that as statistically impossible.
They were claiming to feed a population bigger than some American cities.
And the fraud itself wasn't even subtle. It was incredibly brazen. Meal sites just submitted claims for food they never served.
And they faked the paperwork. I mean, one of the most shocking examples in the source material is Safari Restaurant. This business used to report about $600,000 in annual revenue. Respectable.
And then suddenly,
They claimed to be serving 5,000 children daily.
5,000. And they managed to successfully bill the state for over $16 million. So how did they justify it?
Fake documentation, specifically fake attendance rosters. They just used random manufactured lists of names. They generated thousands of names and claimed those were the kids being fed.
Wow.
And here's where it gets really interesting structure-wise. It wasn't just, simple theft from the government. FOF set up this deeply corrupt internal pay-to-play system.
That's a core mechanism the indictments describe. If you were a site operator and you wanted their sponsorship, which was the license you needed to get the federal funds, you had to pay.
Illicit bribes and kickbacks.
Yes, directly to FOF employees. And this was on top of the standard 10 to 15% administrative fees they were allowed to charge. So essentially, FOF was selling access to a federal money faucet they had turned on full blast.
So what did they do with all this money? They didn't even try to hide the luxury. The proceeds were immediately laundered through shell companies and just poured into these extravagant personal purchases.
We saw Porsches, a Tesla, a 2021 Cadillac Escalade.
A Dodge Charger Hellcat, a Mercedes S-Class sedan.
And one defendant just audaciously bought a $1.2 million home in Minnesota that came with its own indoor basketball court.
The audacity is what really brings this to life for you, the listener. And this wasn't just a local scam either. Huge amounts of money were wired abroad, to Kenya, to Turkey.
Our source material notes one defendant spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to purchase an aircraft in Nairobi.
Think about that. Money that was intended to buy school lunches for vulnerable kids in the Twin Cities was instead used to buy a private plane overseas. So the focus has to shift to accountability. With such clear, just overwhelming evidence of fraud, how did the Minnesota Department of Education, the MDE, the agency in charge of oversight, how did they let this happen for so long?
Well, the findings from the Minnesota Office of the Legislative Auditor, the OLA, they're just damning. They detail a complete catastrophic failure of basic oversight. MDE had data showing this impossible growth long before the FBI finally raided them.
They ignored red flags that were, they were blaring sirens, not flags. Even before the pandemic, back in October 2019, FOF was already an outlier.
It had 6 times the number of meal sites compared to the average sponsor. That rapid, unusual expansion, that should have been the first major signal right there.
And that signal only got louder. We mentioned the 2,800% growth, but look at the financials in late 2020. In December of that year, FOF requested $8 million for meals served in a single week.
$8 million in 1 week. Now let's put that in perspective for you. The entire Minneapolis Public School District received only $17 million for the entire year of 2020.
That comparison is just, it's staggering. $8 million in a week versus $17 million in a year for the city's main provider.
Yeah.
That should have been an immediate hard stop on all payments.
And yet the sources show MDE failed to act effectively on that data. This really points to clear administrative malpractice, not just some simple negligence.
The OLA audit details it,
Huh.
right? The specific operational choices that just created these opportunities.
They do. For example, MDE approved FOF's 2021 application, even though it was missing required documentation on financial internal controls. That's like gatekeeping 101.
And even when they did try to validate claims, the process was completely broken. Auditors found that the very documents MGE collected from the meal sites, they often contained what they called indications of the alleged fraud.
So they had the evidence of irregularity right there in their hands.
But they approved all meal claims without investigating. It was a rubber stamp.
And maybe the single most egregious failure involves the complaints. Between 2018 and 2021, MDE received 30 complaints specifically about FOF.
Okay, so what did they do with those 30 complaints?
Well, instead of conducting an external investigation, MDE asked FOF to investigate the complaints against itself.
That is the literal definition of asking the fox to guard the henhouse.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets complicated for the regulators. When MDE finally did try to stop payments in 2020, FOF went on the offensive.
They weaponized litigation. They sued the state.
On what grounds?
They accused the state regulators of racism and discrimination. That move immediately put MDE on the defensive, and a judge, in the short term, actually sided with FOF.
How is that possible?
The judge ruled that MDE didn't have the statutory authority at that moment to stop the payments without providing more due process. So that legal move, it basically forced the state to keep funding the fraud, at least temporarily.
It shows how criminals can exploit bureaucracy and paralysis.
Right.
So given the monumental scale of this alleged theft, the political fallout was, well, massive and immediate.
It's a profound political crisis, and we have to report on the context here. 82 of the 92 defendants across the 3 major Minnesota fraud schemes are Somali-American. That demographic reality became an instant flashpoint.
And President Trump seized on it, calling the entire Somali community garbage and directing attention at the state administration.
Right, and while the U.S. Attorney's Office has been very clear that, 50 people have pleaded guilty and 7 were convicted in the FOF case, they've also been clear that no evidence has been presented by prosecutors linking defendants to purposefully funding terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab.
That's a key distinction for you to note. The prosecutors haven't made that case.
Correct. But the claim continues. Critics and conservative commentators still allege that stolen funds were funneled through informal money transfer systems, they're called hawalas, to the al-Qaeda-linked terror group, Al-Shabaab.
So even though it's unproven by the DOJ, that claim itself remains a really powerful political tool to attack the administration.
It absolutely does. And amidst all this, L-Team Governor Peggy Flanagan, who's running for U.S. Senate, launched a defense of the community. She attacked Trump's comments as a vile, racist stream of consciousness.
Her actions after that, though, drew a lot of scrutiny from conservative sources.
A great deal. She visited the Carmel Somali market, she appeared on Somali language television wearing a hijab, and she pledged, "We've got your back."
And critics immediately labeled this a stunt, political pandering. They accused her of prioritizing political optics over fixing what they saw as catastrophic administrative failures under her and Governor Walz.
The critique from the right connected her response to a much broader interpretation of the administration's policies.
Yep.
They argued that Flanagan's general hard leftist record,
Which includes being a primary architect of Minnesota's controversial trans refuge laws.
right, which grant the state jurisdiction over children seeking gender-altering procedures without parental consent. The argument is that this created a kind of culture of minimal state intervention.
A sanctuary philosophy.
Exactly, and the conservative argument drawn from our sources is that this philosophy dangerously bled over into a lack of fiscal accountability, and that's what facilitated this historic welfare theft.
So the core political clash here is about what the state should prioritize, accountability or advocacy. The administration says they are supporting a community that's being unjustly targeted.
While critics claim they failed the taxpayer by neglecting the most basic financial oversight.
So let's synthesize what you really need to take away from this complex case. First, the fraud was just monumental in scope, potentially billions in alleged losses, with the FOF case alone stealing over $250 million.
Second, the schemes flourished not by chance, but because state oversight at the Minnesota Department of Education failed systematically. They ignored obvious warnings like that 2,800% growth.
They accepted substandard applications, and they committed what can only be called administrative malpractice by asking the accused to investigate complaints against itself.
And finally, the scandal is now completely tangled up in this volatile political landscape. It raises these profound questions about whether certain regulatory policies created an environment that was just ripe for mass exploitation.
And the sheer number of guilty pleas and convictions, we're at 50 pleas and 7 convictions in the first 2 trials alone, it just confirms the criminal nature of the whole operation.
The contrast is just so stark. You have federal safety nets designed to, prevent starvation and house the needy.
And instead, they're being leveraged to buy $1.2 million luxury homes and exotic cars, all because of what the state's own auditors called profound failures in accountability.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative question for you to consider. If the incentives for state officials lean more toward prioritizing politically expedient rhetoric and performative solidarity rather than the, tedious and often boring work of fiscal integrity and strict bureaucratic oversight, how can any government agency truly guarantee the taxpayer that their money is safe, regardless of which party is in power?
What has to change in the fundamental structure of state oversight to prevent this kind of institutional failure from ever happening again?